Have you ever paid for first-class luxury only to be treated as if you didn't belong? Imagine Dr. Nadira Lewis gliding into AltaJet's flagship cabin, poised and decisive, only to have the very headsets that every other passenger enjoys withheld from her hands. What happens when a simple request for headphones turns into a chilling demonstration of silent bias? How far would you go when microaggressions snowball into outright disrespect at 30,000 feet? Tonight, you'll witness how one woman's quiet resolve ignites a chain reaction from spilled water and curt service to an astonishing confrontation that brings the airline's COO rushing down the jet bridge. You'll feel the hush of solidarity as fellow travelers rise to her defense, the tension in every clasp of a napkin, and the powerful moment when justice comes calling. Will you remain silent or stand up for what's right? If you're ready for a story of resilience, dignity, and real-time reform, buckle up and join us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss an incredible tale of courage in the skies. The terminal was unusually calm for a Monday evening. Warm yellow lights bathed the polished floor tiles, reflecting rows of travelers dragging wheeled suitcases behind them. The usual symphony of voices, rolling bags, and overhead announcements filled the air. But to Dr. Nadira Lewis, it all faded into a soft blur. She moved with unspoken certainty, a kind of quiet confidence earned through years of walking into rooms that weren't built for her. She wore a slate-gray wrap coat over a crisp cream blouse and tailored navy slacks. Her shoes were low-heeled, practical, but elegant. Her natural coils were tucked into a high twist, not because she felt she had to, but because today she didn't feel like explaining herself. She had flown often hundreds of flights for conferences, board meetings, and public health panels around the world. But this flight was different. This flight, Flight 981, was for her. Just 2 days ago, she turned down a high-profile invitation to moderate a federal health policy roundtable. Instead, she'd booked a nonstop from Boston to San Francisco with no itinerary, no briefcase, no pressure, just silence, and maybe the ocean. Maybe she'd walk the Embarcadero in sneakers instead of heels. Maybe she'd do nothing. For once. The woman at the check-in desk barely looked up when Nadira handed her the boarding pass. After a long pause, the agent gave a tight smile. "First class?" she asked, glancing up through her lashes. Nadira nodded, her voice even. "Yes." The woman's hand hovered over her screen for a second longer than necessary. Then she handed the pass back without meeting Nadira's eyes. "Enjoy your flight." Nadira offered a polite nod and moved forward. She didn't react. She never did not to these moments. They were subtle, small, just enough to sting if you let them. But she'd learned, over time, how to let them roll off her without sinking in. She had more important things to carry. As she approached the priority boarding lane, she saw a young couple white, both in hoodies, breeze through without more than a glance from the agent. When Nadira presented her pass, the agent paused again. "Can I see ID, ma'am?" Her eyes flicked to the laminated tag around his neck. "Ryan." Nadira smiled with the same grace she reserved for underprepared panel moderators. "You didn't ask the last two people." Ryan hesitated, then waved her through with an awkward chuckle. "Have a great flight." She didn't respond. Inside the jet bridge, the hum of the aircraft grew louder, rising like a distant wave. Nadira inhaled slowly. This wasn't the first time someone had made her prove she belonged, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But tonight, she didn't have the energy to educate or correct. She just wanted peace. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, The scent of new leather and citrus-scented wipes greeted her. The space was sleek, polished, modern, seats like cocoons, champagne already chilled on silver trays. She glanced down the aisle, rows of polished shoes and pressed slacks. Her row. 2A was near the window. A tall flight attendant turned at the sound of footsteps. Her uniform was perfectly tailored, her blonde ponytail tucked behind one shoulder. She wore the polite expression of someone who had said the same line 1,000 times today. "Welcome aboard," she said, eyes flicking over Nadira's face and down to her seat number. "Can I help you find your seat?" "No, thank you," Nadira replied, voice calm. "I'm in 2A. There was a momentary pause, so quick most would miss it, but Nadira saw it, the faint lift of a brow, the slight downturn of a mouth that had previously been neutral. "Of course," the woman said. "Right this way." Nadira placed her tote bag in the overhead compartment and settled into her seat. The cushions were firm but luxurious, the armrests wide enough to cradle a small meal tray and a glass of wine side by side. She ran a hand over the headrest, appreciating the clean stitching. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to exhale fully. The woman from earlier returned. "Would you like a drink before takeoff?" she asked, voice professionally neutral. Nadira looked up. "Just still water." "Please." "Of course," the attendant said, then disappeared. Nadira reached into her tote, pulled out a well-worn paperback, and rested it gently on the tray table. She wasn't in the mood for a screen today. The novel was one she'd started months ago, but never finished, something about a woman who disappears into the woods and finds herself again. It felt appropriate. A man settled into the seat beside her. Mid-40s, clean-cut, navy suit, Apple Watch. He gave her a brief nod, then pulled out his phone and began typing. He didn't say a word. That was fine. Nadira wasn't in the mood for small talk. The plane continued boarding. Nadira sipped her water quietly as passengers filled in the rows behind her. She noticed the way the flight attendants moved, cheerful, efficient, smiling easily at other passengers. But with her, it was as if they were moving around her. Not with her, as if her presence bent the atmosphere in some way they weren't prepared for. She didn't want to assume anything, but she'd been in enough boardrooms, hotel lobbies, and first-class lounges to know what this was. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But it was there. As the captain's voice came over the intercom to announce the expected flight time and weather in San Francisco, Nadira closed her eyes briefly. She didn't want drama. She didn't want confrontation. She just wanted to fly. But something in her gut told her this flight would not be as quiet as she hoped. The plane rolled slowly from the gate, the muted rumble of its engines vibrating through the cabin floor. Nadira leaned her head back against the leather seat and closed her eyes, allowing the sound to settle her nerves. She had traveled too many miles to count, sat in countless seats like this one, but tonight felt heavier somehow. Not because of the destination, because of the tone already set. She opened her eyes when she felt a subtle tap against her elbow. The man beside her, Reese Calloway, nodded slightly. "Sorry. Just trying to plug this in," he said, motioning toward the power port below the center console. "No worries," Nadira replied, pulling her elbow back to give him space. Reese looked at her for a beat longer than necessary, as if trying to place her. Not in a rude way, just curious. He seemed like the kind of man who knew everyone in his LinkedIn circle by job title. Maybe he thought she looked familiar. Maybe he was just trying to make sense of her presence here. Nadira turned her attention back to her book, flipping to the page she'd dog-eared months ago. But the words blurred. Her thoughts kept drifting. She remembered what the gate agent said. the pause, the ID request, the forced smile, and now here, the flight attendant's micro-stare. Each moment on its own was nothing. Together, they formed a picture she knew too well. Jessica Monroe walked back through the aisle briskly. Her posture was upright, practiced, efficient. She smiled at a couple in the row ahead of Nadira. The man, red-haired and in a fleece vest, chuckled at something she said. Jessica laughed, touched his shoulder lightly, a polished performance. Then she turned to Nadira's row. The smile faded almost instantly. Nadira glanced up, curious whether she'd be asked anything. Jessica's voice was clipped. "Please ensure your bags are fully stowed and your seat is upright." Nadira nodded. "They are." Jessica didn't respond. She just turned and moved on, her heels clicking against the aisle carpet. Nadira caught the way her shoulders stiffened for a half second after turning away, like her presence had left a residue. It wasn't anger Nadira felt. Not yet. It was something more tiring, like a weight pressing into her skin, whispering, "You don't belong here," no matter how softly it's said. The flight attendants completed their safety checks. The lights dimmed slightly, and the cabin settled into that familiar, almost sacred silence before takeoff. Nadira exhaled slowly and looked out the window. Boston twinkled beneath a layer of clouds, its skyline reflecting the last blush of daylight. The aircraft lurched forward. Acceleration came fast. Nadira closed her eyes as the nose tilted up, the roar of the engines rising. She always felt something spiritual during takeoff, like lifting away from gravity meant shedding everything heavy on the ground. For a moment, she tried to imagine herself weightless. Once the seatbelt sign dinged off, Reese pulled out his laptop. Nadira reached down to grab her tote bag and placed it gently on her lap. She unzipped it and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside were her over-ear headphones. Old ones. Not noise-canceling. Just enough to let her focus. Jessica reappeared with a tray of hot towels. She handed them out row by row. When she reached Nadira and Reese, she paused, without a word. She handed Reese a towel, then turned to Nadira. Her hand hovered, then moved away. Nadira blinked. "Excuse me." Jessica smiled, tight and cold. "We've only got a few left. I'll circle back if we find extras." Nadira said nothing. She didn't move. She just watched Jessica walk away. She heard Reese inhale beside her. Not sharply, but loud enough. Nadira looked down at the pouch in her lap and slowly zipped it closed. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised, but the hollow feeling in her chest was impossible to ignore. She looked across the aisle, just in time to see an elderly woman gently pressing a warm towel to her hands. Nadira glanced forward. Row 1 still had them. 2. So it wasn't a supply issue. It was a choice. She leaned back into her seat. The silence between her and Reese thickened. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Jessica returned with a new tray, this time with drinks, champagne flutes and sparkling water in delicate glass. Her voice brightened again for the woman across the aisle. "Here you are, Ms. Reddick, a little refreshment." The woman, Caroline Reddick, as her boarding pass holder displayed, thanked her politely. Then Jessica turned toward Nadira's row. She handed Reese a glass of white wine. "Still water," Nadira said calmly. Before being asked, Jessica didn't answer. She picked up the bottle, poured it quickly, and set the glass down on Nadira's tray with more force than necessary. The water sloshed over the rim. A splash hit the sleeve of Nadira's blouse. Jessica didn't offer a napkin. "Apologies," she said curtly, before turning away. Nadira picked up the cloth napkin from her tray and dabbed the water quietly. Across the aisle, Caroline Reddick watched with narrowed eyes. Reese finally spoke. "That was unnecessary," he said, not looking at her. Nadira offered a faint smile. "It's happened before. That doesn't mean it's right." "I didn't say it was." Reese looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, then closed his laptop. "What's your line of work?" he asked, suddenly changing the subject. Nadira paused, then replied, "Public health strategy. I run a nonprofit that supports maternal health equity." Reese blinked. "That's impressive." She nodded once. "It's exhausting, but important." He glanced toward the galley where Jessica had disappeared. "You must see a lot," Nadira replied. "More than I'd like. Less than I should." Their conversation trailed off. Nadira looked out the window again, watching the curve of the earth soften beneath a blanket of stars. The cabin lights dimmed into a quiet golden hue. Most of the passengers leaned into their seats, drifting into that in-between space of meal service and sleep. But Nadira didn't rest. She opened the Notes app on her phone. She didn't write much, just 3 lines. 1. Towel refused. 2. Water spilled. 3. Headphones withheld. She saved it, closed her phone, set it aside. There would come a time to act, but not yet. Across the aisle, Caroline continued watching, her brow furrowed in silent thought. And in the galley, Jessica Monroe leaned against the wall, exhaling as if she had just escaped something unpleasant. The flight continued. The air was still, but something had shifted. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow as flight attendants prepared to distribute noise-canceling headphones. Nadira watched Jessica Monroe wheel the cart down the aisle, pausing at each row to offer a pair with a practiced smile. Passengers accepted them gratefully, slipping the cushioned cups over their ears. Jessica arrived at Nadira's row and paused. Nadira sat upright, ready to receive the headphones she had requested. Her tray table was stowed, her seat upright, her demeanor calm. She gave Jessica a brief nod. Jessica's lips curved into a polite grin, but her eyes flickered. Nadira extended her hand. Jessica hesitated. She looked at the half-full cart, then back at Nadira. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, voice clipped. "These are only for passengers who request them during boarding." Nadira held her gaze for a beat that felt like a lifetime. She pointed to her ticket, neatly tucked inside her jacket pocket. "I requested mine," she said evenly. "When I boarded," Jessica's smile tightened, "we receive a limited supply. It's first come, first served." Nadira's fingers relaxed on her lap. She considered pressing the matter, but instead leaned back against her seat. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in slowly. When she opened them, they were steady. "Understood," she said quietly. Jessica nodded once and wheeled the cart away. As the attendant's heels clicked against the aisle carpet, Nadira's mind raced through the details. Limited supply, first come, first served, but no one else in first class was denied. Not the man next to her, not the others in row 1. There were plenty of headphones left. It wasn't policy, it was prejudice. She reached into her bag and brought out her own modest canvas pouch. Inside were her travel-worn earbuds. She slipped them in and muted the ambient hum of the cabin. The small sound of voices and overhead announcements receded, yet the weight of what had just occurred pressed into her chest. Across the aisle, Caroline Reddick leaned forward, her voice a low whisper. "Are you okay?" Nadira reached out and placed a hand over Caroline's. The contact was warm and genuine. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." Caroline's eyes flicked toward Jessica, then back to Nadira. "That was wrong," she said softly. Nadira simply nodded and turned her gaze out the window. She forced herself to breathe evenly, feeling the plane's gentle vibration beneath her. An almost imperceptible momentum carried them westward, toward the sun setting over the Pacific. Internal conflict churned quietly. Should she confront Jessica now? Should she make a scene to demand accountability? Part of her missed the fiery protests of her younger days. Part of her longed to stand and call everyone's attention to injustice. But another part knew that anger, unchecked, could be counterproductive. She had spent years refining her responses, her voice, her actions to be precise instruments of change. She closed her eyes and thought back to a meeting years ago. She had addressed a boardroom full of skeptical airline executives about unconscious bias. She had presented data, personal stories, and best practices. Some had nodded politely. Others had glanced at their watches. Few had changed. Now she was living her own lecture. The cart rattled as Jessica passed by again. Nadira kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. Caroline squeezed her hand gently. Nadira squeezed back. Then the cabin lights brightened for meal service. Nadira listened to the soft clink of silverware and the rustle of menus. Voices resumed. Phones beeped. Now, more than ever. Nadira felt the divide between the polished luxury of first class and the invisible barriers she still encountered. Jessica returned to Nadira's row carrying a black menu folder. Her tone was professional, almost warm. "Dinner options tonight are salmon with lemon dill sauce or roasted vegetable penne. Would you like to look?" Now Nadira took the menu and studied it briefly before looking back at Jessica. "Thank you. I'll have the salmon." "Please." Jessica tucked the menu under her arm and moved on. As Nadira glanced over the folder, she noticed Jessica serving others fluidly, no hesitation, no sign of friction. To everyone else, this flight was routine. To Nadira, every interaction felt like a test. She stared down at the detailed descriptions of her dinner choices. She felt a twinge of guilt. Food was food. A meal was a meal. Yet she knew these small indignities were more than they seemed. They were questions of worth and belonging. She picked up her wine glass, took a sip of the crisp white wine Reese had already poured for her, and let the tension in her shoulders ease. Caroline leaned closer. "Next time you should speak up." Nadira forced a smile. Next time. She didn't want to wait, but sometimes timing was everything. She reopened her notebook app and wrote a single line. Denied headphones, despite first-class status. Then she deleted it. She was not here to compile a grievance list. She was here to live, to rest, to recharge. But when the salmon arrived, served by Jessica with the same steady professionalism she used for everyone else, Nadira noticed the difference. The salmon on Caroline's plate was arranged artfully, garnished with microgreens and edible flowers. Nadira's was a simple fillet with a sprig of parsley. She met Jessica's eyes as the attendant moved on. Jessica paused for a moment, then continued down the aisle. Nadira reached for her salad. Inside her mind, she was already planning. She might call someone. She might ask to speak with the purser. She might simply publish her notes as a short essay on her nonprofit's blog, exposing the disparity. The choice was hers. She ate quietly. Each bite of salmon was a small celebration of her ability to find calm and clarity in discomfort. The cabin lights dimmed again as the meal service ended. Passengers leaned back into their seats, some dozing, others scrolling on devices. Nadira reached for her earbuds again. She chose an ambient playlist she had curated for nights like this slow piano. soft strings. She closed her eyes and allowed the music to wash over her. Her breathing slowed. Her thoughts organized themselves. But beneath the calm surface, she felt the stirrings of resolve. Tolerance had its limits. Patience, too. Tonight, she would decide how to respond. And she would make sure her response mattered. She glanced across at Caroline one more time. Caroline offered a reassuring smile and a slight nod. Nadira returned the gesture. The flight settled into its cruising rhythm. The gentle hum of engines, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of ice in a glass. Nadira let the sound envelope her, yet she remained alert, attuned to every nuance around her. It was in these small moments, denied headphones, spilled water, uneven meal presentation, that the real story unfolded. She would honor these moments with action, but not just action for herself. Action for every person who had ever felt unseen in an environment designed to showcase wealth and status. She placed her elbows on the armrests, uncrossed her legs, and sat with perfect poise. Her eyes drifted up to the overhead compartment, where the extra headphones rested. She thought of all the people who had asked and been ignored. Then she thought of the person who would answer her call, Asha Whitmore, COO of AltaJet Airlines, a fellow black woman who had once confided in Nadira her own experiences of bias. Asha was powerful, compassionate, and strategic. Nadira had worked with her to develop equity training modules. She knew that Asha would not brush this aside. As Flight 981 continued west over the continent, Nadira allowed herself one small indulgence, a private smile. She felt a spark of satisfaction, not from vengeance or schadenfreude, but from the certainty that she would not be silenced. All around her, people slept, read, dreamed. Above them, the moon spilled silver light across the wing. Nadira closed her eyes and immersed herself in the music pulsing through her ears. She visualized the steps she would take. She rehearsed the calm firmness of her voice. She made mental notes of each slight and each patronizing smile. When she opened her eyes again, the cabin was quiet, punctuated only by the distant heartbeat of the engines. Nadira leaned back and surrendered to the rhythm. She felt the tension ease from her shoulders and settle into a focused determination. This flight was far from over, and neither was her resolve. The cabin lights brightened again, signaling the start of drink service. Nadira sat poised, fingers resting lightly on her tablet. She had silenced all notifications and slipped on her own earbuds, but the world of sound and motion pressed in nonetheless. Jessica Monroe approached with a polished trolley, each item arranged with military precision. Crystal glasses, neatly folded napkins, and bottles of San Pellegrino lined the top shelf. Jessica paused at the aisle, her eyes scanning Nadira's row. She offered a practiced smile to Reese and Caroline before turning her gaze to Nadira. That smile, Nadira thought, was an invitation to dismissiveness. "Sparkling water?" Jessica asked, her tone courteous but distant. Nadira met her gaze with calm assurance. "Yes, please." Jessica nodded and reached for a bottle. She twisted the cap with exaggerated care. Nadira watched every movement, the tightening of Jessica's jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes. The attendant poured water into Nadira's glass. Jessica set the bottle aside and lowered the glass toward the tray table. Suddenly, there was a slight tilt. Nadira's hand reached out reflexively, but stopped short. A single drop splashed onto her lap, followed by another. Cold water spread across the fabric of her tailored slacks and pooled on the leather edge of her bag. The sleek bag now bore a damp sheen. "Oh dear," Jessica said, eyes widening ever so slightly. But she did not extend a napkin. Instead, she straightened and placed the glass with careful deliberation on the tray table. The water had dribbled into the seam of Nadira's slacks. Nadira inhaled slowly, centering herself. "I'll get a towel," Jessica added, her voice carrying a hint of mock concern. She turned on her heel, leaving Nadira to dab at the damp spots with the napkin she had retrieved from the tray. The napkin was small, flimsy, and offered little help. Nadira pressed it to her slacks and then her bag with deliberate patience. She blocked out the chatter as other passengers commented softly on their meals and their headphones. Across the aisle, Caroline Reddick reached into her bag and produced a generous cloth napkin. She handed it discreetly to Nadira. The gesture spoke volumes. Nadira accepted it with gratitude and pressed it into her lap. "Thank you," Nadira whispered. Caroline smiled. "You're welcome." Nadira continued blotting, aware that each dab carried a larger meaning. The water incident was deliberate. Jessica had no reason to spill other passengers' drinks. It could have been an accident. Yet this felt intentional, part of a pattern. Nadira's jaw tightened slightly. She pressed her legs together, careful not to touch the damp spots again. The hum of conversation continued. Nadira closed her eyes for a moment, tapping her foot lightly. When she opened them, she noticed Reese watching with sympathy. He avoided looking at Jessica, but his eyes flicked to Nadira repeatedly, a silent alliance forming. Jessica returned with the trolley, this time laden with dinner trays. Her posture was slightly stiffer. She loaded Nadira's meal onto the tray table without a word. The salmon fillet glistened under the cabin lights, a sprig of parsley laid to one side. Nadira noticed Caroline's tray had an extra garnish, a drizzle of herb oil arranged in an artful swirl. It wasn't about the food. It was the message, a small, consistent reminder of difference. Nadira took a shallow breath and lifted her fork. The salmon was perfectly cooked. She chewed thoughtfully. She was late for this meal, but not too late to make a statement. Plate cleared. She pressed the call button once. Jessica appeared promptly. "I'd like to request more napkins," Nadira said softly. Jessica's expression flickered. "Of course." She retrieved a stack of flimsy napkins and handed them over. Nadira accepted them without comment. Each napkin was a silent witness. Jessica then looked at Caroline and Reese, offering smiles and additional condiments. Both received individual bottles, olive oil, fresh bread. Caroline nodded in thanks to Jessica. Jessica's face relaxed again, as if Nadira did not exist. Nadira held a napkin in each hand. She waited for the noise of service to die down. She placed both napkins on the table and folded them neatly. The action caught Jessica's eye. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Jessica asked. "I have one more request," Nadira replied, voice calm and quiet. "May I speak with your supervisor?" The cabin fell quiet. Jessica blinked. She glanced toward the galley and then back to Nadira. The smile was gone. This was no longer a polite interaction. Nadira felt the weight of every passenger's gaze. She heard the soft shuffling of feet and the clicking of seatbelts. Jessica swallowed. "The purser," she asked, voice wavering. "Yes, please." Jessica nodded and hurried toward the back. Nadira watched her go, then turned her gaze to the window. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, a tapestry of stars that held no bias, no prejudice. Up there, everyone was equal, drifting above the world's divisions. Reese leaned forward. "You good?" She turned to him and nodded gently. "I am." Caroline spoke from the aisle. "You've been so composed." A small smile touched Nadira's lips. "I try." The flight attendant purser appeared. An older woman with soft gray hair tucked into a neat bun and kind eyes behind thin-frame glasses. She approached with hands clasped in front of her. "Ms. Lewis, I'm Danielle Carter, the purser. How may I help you?" Nadira swallowed down the tense lump in her throat. "Thank you for coming. I've encountered a series of issues tonight, beginning with being denied headphones despite requesting them, then having water deliberately spilled on me, and minimal service since. I'd like to document these events." Purser Carter's expression was one of genuine concern. "That is unacceptable. I apologize. May I take your details so we can address this as a formal complaint?" Nadira handed her phone with her notes open, the 3 bullet points visible on the screen. The purser read them, her brow furrowing. "I'm very sorry. We can certainly note each of these incidents, and I will personally ensure you receive the same amenities offered to other first-class passengers. If you'd prefer, I can have the crew apologize directly." Nadira shook her head. "I appreciate that, but an apology is not enough. I want accountability, and I want you to know there's a larger issue at play." Danielle Carter nodded slowly. "I understand. I will pass this to our in-flight manager and make sure corporate is notified upon landing. Is there anything else I can do right now?" Nadira closed her book on her salmon dish. "For now, please ensure I receive my headphones and service equal to everyone else." "Of course," Carter said. She paused, then added, "Miss Lewis, if you need anything else, just press the button. I am truly sorry." As Carter walked away, Nadira returned Caroline's gaze. Caroline offered an encouraging nod. Reese exhaled quietly, relief evident in his posture. Nadira leaned back. The tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. Now the incident had been recognized officially. Still, she knew that recognition alone rarely led to real change. But this was the start. She closed her eyes and pictured the scene ahead landing at San Francisco International, meeting the COO who had once worked with her on equity training. Nadira imagined the look on Asha Whitmore's face when she heard the report. She could almost hear the swift steps down the jet bridge, the tap of heels on the floor, the hush falling over the cabin as leadership arrived. She allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Then she opened her eyes. The flight continued, the hum unbroken. Nadira picked up her own earbuds and pressed play on a soft jazz track, letting the music fill the empty spaces. She felt sharper, more present. Tonight had shifted. The water incident was no longer just an indignity. It was a catalyst, a signal that these little moments of bias could no longer be ignored. She tapped a quick note in her phone. Formal complaint submitted, awaiting resolution. Then she silenced her device. It was time to rest. But before closing her eyes, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small photograph. It was of her daughter, smiling under a summer sun. Nadira pressed it to her heart. For her daughter. For every woman of color who had ever been minimized. For herself. She laid the photo beside her and leaned back, finally allowing the cabin lights and the distant stars to lull her towards sleep. Tomorrow the flight would land, and the real work would begin. The cabin settled into a hushed lull after the meal service. Soft overhead lights glowed, revealing quiet clusters of passengers flipping through magazines, peering into tablets, or simply gazing out into the darkness beyond the window. Nadira sat quietly, her hands resting on the edge of her tray table. She felt a subtle shift in the air, as though the entire first-class cabin had leaned in just slightly, listening for what might come next. She looked across the aisle at Caroline Reddick, who was clearing her plate with deliberate care. Caroline caught her gaze and offered an encouraging smile. That small gesture meant more than words. It signaled solidarity in a place where small indignities often felt invisible. A few rows back, an elderly man in a navy blazer, his hair silver at the temples, motioned his wife, leaning close to whisper something. Nadira caught snippets. Treated differently. I can't believe it. The words were soft, but carried urgency. The couple spoke in low tones, but their indignation was clear. Nadira's heart warmed at the sight of fellow travelers noticing the disparity. Across from her, Reese Calloway picked up his glass of wine and cleared his throat, drawing Nadira's attention. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I am." Her voice was measured, her composure intact. "Thank you." Reese glanced toward Jessica, who was restocking silverware in the galley. "That was more than a spill," he murmured. "I've worked in corporate service for years. That was no accident." Nadira leaned back, her eyes softening. "I know." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Sometimes, when it's small enough, people say it's trivial. But it's not trivial when it keeps happening." Reese studied her face. "What do you think it means?" Nadira laid a gentle finger on her note app. She swiped it open and showed him 3 succinct bullet points. Denied headphones. Water spilled. Unequal service. It means there's a pattern. Reese nodded and tapped on the points. "I should speak up," he said. She shook her head. "I'm handling this. You've done enough by noticing." He smiled ruefully. It didn't feel like enough. Caroline reached over and patted Nadira's hand. "You should let him," she said softly. "It matters when all of us speak." Nadira inhaled. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. Somewhere behind her, the elderly couple had joined the conversation, their voices low but firm. "I saw what happened," the man said. "Any excuse would have worked, but she chose to treat you differently." His wife added, "It's not right." Nadira closed her eyes and pressed her fingertips to her temples. She whispered a silent thank you. Their words reminded her she was not alone. In boardrooms and offices, she often stood by herself, advocating for equity. Tonight, here at 30,000 feet, she had allies in an unexpected place. She recalled a training session from 2 years ago. She had spoken to a room of pilots and flight attendants about unconscious bias. She used real-world examples, statistics, interactive activities. Some participants had nodded and taken notes. A few had scoffed quietly. 1 or 2 had stormed out. She ended the session by asking everyone to commit to one small change in their daily interactions. The change she modeled that day was offering headphones to every first-class passenger without question. She had challenged them to recognize that dignity belongs to every human. Now she lived that lesson. She opened her journal app and began typing, "I have allies here. Several. They see it. They acknowledge it." She paused, then added, "Tomorrow, I will propose systemic changes." Reese watched her fingers move. "What will you say?" Nadira considered. Her inner voice whispered that she wanted swift action, yet her outer voice demanded precision. "I'll call Asha Whitmore," she said. "I'll walk her through each moment." Reese's brow furrowed. "Cool. Whitmore." Nadira nodded. "We worked together on an equity audit. She's no stranger to these issues." Caroline listened, absorbing every word. "She'll listen," Caroline said. "She respects you." Nadira closed her journal and placed the phone aside. She looked out at the gently curving winglet by moonlight. Below, the earth was hidden by clouds. Above, nothing but stars. In between, a microcosm of humanity. The gentle hum of the engines was a steady metronome, It reminded Nadira of rhythmic mantras used in meditation. Breathe in, breathe out, observe, act. She turned back to Reese. Thank you for caring. He tilted his head. Thank you for being an example. They shared a brief smile. Across the aisle, Caroline gave an encouraging nod. Nadira squeezed Reese's hand briefly, then slid back into her seat. She folded her arms in her lap and let her gaze drift upward toward the overhead bins. A flight attendant approached to collect empty wine glasses. Jessica was nowhere in sight. Nadira felt a flicker of relief and tension, both. The absence of Jessica did not erase the pattern that had emerged. If anything, it intensified Nadira's resolve. She closed her eyes and sank into the plush headrest. In her mind, she replayed each slight and each act of kindness. The cart rattles, the spilled water, the offered napkin, the whispered support. It was a story of contrast, denial, and generosity, prejudice, and empathy. She thought of her daughter, the sparkle in her brown eyes, the pride she felt when little hands wrapped around Nadira's finger. She thought of the countless women who struggled to prove their worth in places built to marginalize them. Her heartbeat slowed. The cabin lights dimmed further into night mode. The first-class cabin was nearly empty now, only a few passengers still awake. Nadira felt the weight of fatigue, but refused to rest until she had clarity on next steps. She took a small notebook from her tote. It was leather-bound, and it accompanied her on countless flights. She flipped through pages meeting notes, sketch ideas for public health campaigns, a pressed flower from a long-ago conference. She selected a blank page and scribbled, Meeting with Asha Whitmore Review, in-flight training modules, propose mandatory equity drills, establish passenger feedback committee. She paused, then added one more public statement by Monday. She closed the notebook and returned it to her tote. The act felt symbolic. She was gathering weapons of accountability, not to punish, but to build something better. Across from her, Caroline glanced at her. I admire your calm, Caroline said. Nadira offered her a gentle smile. Calm is a choice. Caroline nodded thoughtfully. I'll remember that. Reese spoke up. If you need anything, testimony, data, whatever, just ask. Nadira looked at him with genuine warmth. Thank you. I'm grateful. She allowed herself a few moments of stillness, inhaling the scent of her lavender-infused scarf, hearing the rhythmic whoosh of the ventilation, feeling the slight sway of the aircraft. Then she closed her eyes, letting the world fade. But even in that near sleep, her mind plotted the words she would speak, the changes she would demand. She envisioned Asha's poised expression as she listened, the nod of recognition when she understood the gravity, the swift movement toward accountability. She drifted off to sleep, her earbuds still in place. Soft jazz filled the small space behind her eyelids. Her breathing deepened, and in that darkness, the quiet rebellion inside her burned bright, a determination that flew higher than the plane itself. The cabin lights dimmed almost completely, leaving only the pale glow of reading lamps beside each seat. Nadira sat upright, taking a slow sip of the sparkling water supplied by Purser Carter earlier. Her heart still hummed with the residual adrenaline of filing her complaint, but she felt steadier now. Sleep beckoned, yet she knew the journey was far from over. The smallest details still mattered. A soft chime indicated the start of the final service round. A flight attendant wheeled a slim cart down the aisle, offering little snack boxes tied with a ribbon. The attendant paused at Reese's row and handed him a chocolate truffle, along with a warm smile. Reese offered Nadira one as the attendant passed by. "Would you like one?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not right now." She kept her voice even, measured. Accepting snacks was harmless, but she preferred to remain focused. The attendant moved on, chatting amiably with a passenger ahead. Caroline leaned over. "They always do this," she whispered. "Chocolate or cheese?" Then a friendly chat. Nadira watched them. The attendant's warmth for some, neutrality for others. She recalled the pattern-shared towels given reluctantly, trays delivered brusquely, headphones withheld, water spilled, all small slights, all part of an unspoken message. She closed her eyes briefly, recalling a phrase from a training she once led: "Bias hides in the mundane." A spilled drop of water, a missing garnish, a curt word, each seemed insignificant in isolation. Together, they formed a narrative of exclusion. Reese spoke. "Were you planning to press further with corporate tonight?" Nadira opened her eyes and regarded him thoughtfully. "Possibly," she replied. "But I think it's better to wait until landing when Asha arrives. That way it becomes more than my story. It's their story." Reese nodded. "Smart." Caroline crossed her arms, her tone earnest. "We're here until they do something." Nadira smiled, grateful. Their eyes met, and she felt buoyed by shared conviction. Around them, the gentle hum of the plane felt both comforting and glaringly ironic. This vehicle was built to transport people together, yet the crew had attempted to separate them. She reclined slightly and reached into her tote for her notebook. The crisp leather surface felt reassuring under her fingertips. She scribbled 3 more bullet points: unequal snack service, friendly banner withheld, final boarding checks delayed. Then she closed the notebook and slid it back in. A hush settled as the plane entered the final hours of flight. Most passengers turned off overhead lights, leaning back to rest. Nadira remained alert, her breathing calm, her mind racing with possibilities for tomorrow. She recalled the conversation with Purser Carter, the genuine apology, the promise of equal service, and yet she knew genuine intent often clashed with ingrained attitudes. A single apology might soothe her momentary discomfort, but it would do nothing to uproot the biases baked into policy and practice. She glanced toward the galley, where the curtain lay drawn across the entrance. Occasionally, a gloved hand emerged to restock water and snacks. No crew member ventured beyond. They had been effectively corralled. A soft vibration ran through the cabin as the seatbelt sign blinked on for a moment. Nadira pressed her fingertips together and looked at the aisle. Only a handful of passengers remained awake. Among them, Caroline's eyes were bright with concern. Reese had closed his laptop but kept his tablet within reach. Even the elderly couple from row 3 whispered to each other. She let the quiet moments stretch before speaking. "I'm thinking about the bigger initiative," she said. "If AltaJet wants to maintain a reputation for excellence, these incidents need to inform training modules, not just one-time reminders, but immersive scenarios for every crew member." Reese leaned forward. "Like role-playing small conflicts, simulating microaggressions." "Exactly," Nadira said. "Something beyond a slide deck. Something that triggers real empathy. These aren't theoretical issues. They happen in real time. We need to build muscle memory for respect." Caroline nodded. "They should hear your voice. Flight attendants trained by you." Nadira pressed her lips together. She remembered the day she stood before a group of airline staff at headquarters. She described exactly these patterns. They had listened politely, but back then she hadn't had the concrete leverage she now wielded. Now she had first-person evidence. She had allies on board. She would ensure her words carried both authority and personal truth. Her gaze drifted up to the ceiling vents, where a faint stream of cool air flowed. The sensation reminded her of countless late nights in the office, drafting protocols and policies. She relished the idea of drafting something that would embed equity into every routine procedure. She closed her eyes, letting the soft jazz track from her earbuds lull her momentarily. Then she sat forward and spoke again. Tomorrow, I'll propose the equity feedback loop after every flight. A brief, anonymous survey for passengers to rate service fairness. That data can feed into performance reviews. Reese clapped once softly. That's brilliant. Accountability through data. Nadira nodded. And we can cross-check with crew schedules, identify patterns, address them quickly. She paused. Something in her chest tightened. A memory surfaced. Her mentor, a pioneering epidemiologist, once told her that systems change happened when you gathered evidence, built consensus, and applied pressure at the right moment. Tonight, she was gathering evidence. Tomorrow, she would apply that pressure. Caroline placed a hand on Nadira's arm. You're going to change an entire industry. Nadira's lips curved in a modest smile. I hope so. The cabin lights brightened again as the crew prepared for landing. Nadira opened her eyes. The hour of descent had begun. The seatbelt sign dinged on. The plane dipped slightly, then leveled. The whine of the engines deepened. She looked around at her fellow passengers. Some checked their watch. Some rubbed their eyes. They had witnessed what she had. They would remember. Nadira exhaled slowly and looked out the window at the lights of San Francisco appearing below. They sparkled like a field of diamonds against the dark sea. She imagined stepping off the aircraft and into a flurry of activity. At the gate, Asha Whitmore and a small team would await her. Corporate communications, HR, legal. They would stand together, confronting the crew she would summon. Nadira felt a swirl of emotions: anticipation, resolve, a quiet satisfaction, but also a pang of vulnerability. Public confrontation, even when justified, came with risks. Her reputation, her nonprofit's reputation, even her daughter's future might come under scrutiny in the headlines. She shoved the thought aside. Courage was not reckless. Courage was conscious. She closed her eyes briefly and prayed for steadiness. Then she opened them again, flexed her fingers, and pressed a quick note in her phone. Landing soon. Asha on standby. Allies witnessed. Evidence ready. She hit save. Then she turned off her phone screen and placed it in her bag. She folded her hands in her lap and stared ahead. The cabin lights softening into twilight. The engine singing. The world below rushing past. For the passengers who had shared sympathy or whispered support. For those still asleep, unaware, but equally worthy. For her daughter, who needed to know her mother faced injustice with dignity. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and allowed herself a moment of rest before the storm of accountability. The small things had become big, and there she sat, poised to make them matter. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Most passengers leaned back, arms folded or eyes closed. The hum of the engines transformed into a gentle lullaby. But for Nadira Lewis, the night was far from over. She sat upright, her gaze focused on the curve of the wing illuminated by moonlight. Every small slight played back in her mind, the cart rattling past without headphones, the cold glare when she requested a towel, the measured distance in Jessica Monroe's tone. It was a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Reese Calloway leaned in, his voice low. I can't believe she denied you again. Nadira offered him a small, tired smile. It wasn't a mistake. He looked at her in the soft glow. "You're right. It's intentional." She nodded once. No anger surfaced, only determination. She tapped her phone, adding another note to her list. Continued denial of service, despite purser's intervention. The data was stacking up. Now it was more than an anecdote. It was evidence. Moments later, the familiar clink of the headphone cart interrupted the hush. Nadira looked up. Jessica Monroe emerged from the galley, wheeling the cart with feigned cheerfulness. As the attendant distributed headphones row by row, the cabin watched. Caroline Reddick leaned forward, eyes wide. Reese shifted in his seat. Jessica paused at Reese's row and handed him the last set. Reese accepted with a nod. Nadira cleared her throat, and the cart's momentum stalled. Jessica looked up, expression polished but guarded. Nadira waited. The passengers held their breath. "I'd like a set, please," Nadira said, her voice calm but firm. Jessica's lips thinned. She glanced at the empty cart top. No headphones left. She tapped the cart's frame as if to confirm. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We've run out." Nadira raised an eyebrow. "But you just gave one to Mr. Calloway." Jessica swallowed. "That's our policy. You must request during boarding." A collective murmur rose from the cabin. A man in row 4 called out, "I didn't request mine. Got one anyway." Others nodded. Caroline's voice chimed in, "I saw you give him one just now." The tension swelled. Jessica's composure cracked. She looked toward the galley, hesitation in her eyes. Then she straightened, took a small breath, and wheeled the cart away. The click of her heels echoed down the aisle. A hush settled. Reese turned to Nadira. "I'm sorry you had to do that." She shook her head. "You did nothing wrong." Caroline spoke up. "This is unacceptable." She pointed at the cart moving away. She knew exactly what she was doing. Others began to murmur in agreement. An elderly couple leaned forward. "In all my years of flying, I've never seen anything like that," the man said. His wife nodded, brows furrowed. "It's a clear sign." Nadira felt a surge of gratitude. These strangers had witnessed her treatment and spoken out. The cabin had become an audience. In that moment, she realized her resistance had ignited something collective. She straightened in her seat and spoke loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Thank you all for your support. This is not just about me. It's about ensuring we all receive equal treatment." Applause rippled through the row behind her. A few passengers gave Jessica's retreating back disapproving looks. Reese smiled. Caroline beamed. Even the elderly couple seated 2 rows back offered approving nods. Nadira turned back to her window, her heart steady. The night sky stretched beyond the wing, infinite and impartial. Up here, prejudice had no bearing. Down there, it still rained, but not for long. She took out her notebook and added a new entry passenger solidarity catalyzed. Real-time intervention report. The pattern had become a catalyst for collective action. A gentle vibration signaled the crew preparing for final descent. Nadira closed her notebook, tucked it into her tote, and leaned back. The small rebellion had manifested. She said nothing more, letting the shift in cabin energy carry her forward. As the seatbelt sign clicked off moments later, Caroline leaned in. "You started something tonight." Nadira looked at her. "We started something," she corrected. "All of us," Reese added. "When we land, count on my statement." The elderly man called over, "And mine." The cabin felt warm, unified. Nadira closed her eyes, letting the swell of collective resolve wash over her. Microaggressions had met their match in unity. Below, the lights of San Francisco beckoned. Above, the stars witnessed their solidarity. And between sky and earth, a group of strangers sat together, determined that bias would no longer be tolerated. Nadira settled into her seat as the cabin lights dimmed to a soothing indigo. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly, studded with stars that seemed close enough to touch. She inhaled deeply, feeling the cool, recycled air brush against her face. It had been hours since she first encountered Jessica Monroe's subtle coldness, and even longer since she'd begun to catalog each slight. Now, with only a few hours left before landing, it was time to bring in reinforcements. She reached into her tote and retrieved her phone. The soft glow of the screen illuminated her thoughtful expression. Her fingers tapped the screen, opening the secure contacts app she used for professional emergencies. There was one name she sought: Asha Whitmore, Chief Operating Officer of AltaJet Airlines, a woman whose reputation for swift, thoughtful action was legendary in the industry. Nadira paused for a moment, recalling the afternoon they'd spent together at the corporate headquarters. Asha had listened intently as Nadira outlined bias in high-pressure settings. She had taken notes, asked questions, and promised a thorough review. Nadira had believed her then. She believed her now. She tapped Asha's name and watched the screen as it dialed. The phone rang twice, the familiar tone echoing through the hushed cabin. Reese leaned over, his eyebrows lifting in curiosity, but Nadira shook her head slightly. This was her moment, and she needed to handle it quietly. On the third ring, a voice answered Nadira. "It's Asha." Asha's tone was warm, tinged with concern and readiness. Nadira felt a small surge of relief. "Asha," she said softly, careful to keep her voice low. "I'm on Flight 981. There's been a series of incidents: headphones denied, water spilled, overall service withheld. It's pattern bias. I filed a complaint with Purser Carter, but I need your support before we land." There was a brief pause. Nadira imagined Asha's brow furrowing with every word. "I'm on my way," Asha said finally. "I've flagged legal, HR, in-flight training. We'll meet you at Gate 22 in San Francisco. I'll be the first one off the jet bridge." "Thank you," Nadira whispered. "The crew is jittery now. Jessica knows something's up. I've sent the alert." Asha replied. "They're preparing. I'll handle it personally. You just remain calm." "I will," Nadira promised. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, letting the weight of anticipation settle. When she opened them, the faint glow of cabin indicators reflected in her lashes. "See you soon," Asha said, and the line went silent. Nadira slipped her phone back into her bag and exhaled. Beneath her composed exterior, a hopeful warmth spread across her chest. She had done her part. Now it was up to AltaJet's leadership to follow through. Reese leaned in, concern still etched on his face. "Everything okay?" She nodded, offering him a gentle smile. "Yes. Asha Whitmore is meeting me at Gate 22 the moment we land. This ends good," he said. "That's the assurance you deserve." Caroline Reddick, perched across the aisle, caught Nadira's eye and gave her an encouraging nod. The elderly couple from row 3 placed a set of unused headphones on Nadira's tray, their silent gift a testament to solidarity. Nadira pressed a finger to her heart in gratitude. Moments later, the seatbelt sign pinged on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, soft and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just begun our descent into San Francisco International Airport. Please ensure your seats are upright, tray tables stowed, and carry-on items secured. Nadira straightened, sliding her bag under the seat in front of her. She looked around at her fellow first-class passengers. None seemed eager to dislodge this fragile unity. Instead, they offered her quiet smiles, shoulders squared in solidarity. Up until now, the cabin had been a microcosm of bias and exclusion. Now it had become a chorus of support. As the wheels touched runway pavement, a gentle jolt ran through the aircraft. Overhead lights flickered as the cabin's atmosphere shifted from flight to expectation. Jessica Monroe emerged briefly down the aisle, appearing at Nadira's row as if on cue. The attendant froze when she saw Nadira's steady gaze. Nadira held Jessica's eyes for a long moment before looking away. Jessica's forced smile faltered, and she retreated into the galley. Nadira leaned back in her seat, focusing on the window. The wet runway lights flashed by, casting fleeting reflections on the wing. In those reflections, she saw not a woman wronged, but a catalyst for change. She closed her eyes, letting the sensation of motion remind her that they were moving toward accountability. Down the aisle, Purser Danielle Carter made her way back, carrying a fresh set of noise-canceling headphones. She knelt beside Nadira. Her voice was soft. "Ms. Lewis, I'm so sorry for the earlier service failures. These are yours, no charge, and you'll receive a full amenity kit at the gate." Nadira accepted the headphones, her fingers brushing Carter's. "Thank you," she said gently. "I appreciate that." Carter rose and offered a sincere nod. "Safe travels." A hush fell once more as passengers glanced around. Some picked up their own headphones. Others tapped out notes on their devices. It was as if the cabin collectively exhaled, releasing the tension that had held it captive. The jet bridge doors opened with a pneumatic hiss. One by one, passengers stood, gathering their belongings. Nadira rose slowly, smoothing the lapel of her blazer. Reese and Caroline stepped aside to make space for her. The elderly couple cleared their throats quietly and offered approving smiles. Just then, Asha Whitmore appeared at the doorway, flanked by 2 security officers and a small team from HR and corporate communications. She wore a tailored black suit and a look of unshakable resolve. Her posture radiated authority and compassion in equal measure. Nadira met her gaze and allowed a small smile. Asha's eyes were sharp, assessing, proud. Nadira's heart swelled at the sight of her ally. "Dr. Lewis," Asha said, her voice carrying down the aisle so that the remaining passengers could hear. She sounded unwavering. "I apologize for your treatment tonight. We take these matters seriously at AltaJet." She turned to address Jessica Monroe, who had appeared at the back of the plane, her expression pale. "Jessica Monroe," Asha continued, "your employment with AltaJet is terminated effective immediately. You are to disembark and report to HR." Gas rippled through the cabin. Jessica's mouth opened and closed, disbelief etched on her face. She blinked at Asha, at Nadira, then at the security officers who stepped forward. Jessica's protest came out as stammers. I didn't." Asha held up a hand. "You mistook microaggressions for protocol. That is unacceptable. You will be escorted off the premises." Jessica was guided down the aisle, head bowed, as passengers watched in stunned silence. Even the elderly couple rose to their feet in quiet applause. Asha returned to Nadira's side. She offered her a supportive smile. "Thank you for your courage," she said softly. "Your story will drive the reforms we've discussed." Nadira nodded, emotion flickering across her calm features. "Thank you for listening and for acting." As Nadira stepped onto the jet bridge, each footfall echoed in the narrow corridor. Reese and Caroline flanked her, and behind them the passengers moved in respectful formation. Nadira felt a sense of triumph and relief wash over her, tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. At the bottom of the jet bridge, press and corporate staff waited. Cameras clicked, microphones thrust forward. Nadira inhaled deeply. She squared her shoulders and walked toward her next role advocate, leader, changemaker. Every moment of indignity tonight had built toward this a clear statement that bias would not be tolerated. Outside, the cool San Francisco air greeted them with a breeze. Nadira paused, looking back at the aircraft. For a moment she closed her eyes and let the gratitude and resolve fill her. Then she stepped forward into the night, ready for the conversation that would reshape AltaJet's future, and perhaps the industry's. The soft thrum of the engines deepened as Flight 981 began its descent toward San Francisco International Airport. Overhead, the cabin lights flickered brighter, bathing the first-class cabin in a gentle glow. Nadira Lewis remained seated, her posture relaxed yet poised, as though every fiber of her being were woven into a fabric of resolve. Around her, the passengers began to stir, collecting their belongings and settling in for the final approach. A hushed murmur passed through the cabin, punctuated by the occasional rustle of jackets and the click of seatbelt buckles. Nadira felt the faint tremor of anticipation beneath her fingertips. She glanced toward the front, where the galley curtains still hung closed. For the first time since the departure from Boston, the crew had vanished from view. The absence of Jessica Monroe and the remainder of the discriminatory team was palpable, a silent testament to accountability. Reese Calloway leaned over, lowering his voice. "Is that allowed?" he asked. Removing them mid-flight like that, Nadira considered the question, her eyes reflecting the glow of the seatbelt light. If policy is weaponized to exclude, then policy can be wielded to correct, she replied. What matters is that leadership recognized the harm and acted swiftly. Caroline Reddick, sitting across the aisle, gave a small nod of agreement. And they didn't wait until we landed, she said. They handled it right away. Nadira smiled, a small, satisfied curve of her lips. That's the difference between lip service and real service, she said. Her gaze drifted out the window, where the city lights of San Francisco glimmered like a constellation mirrored on the water's surface. Behind her, the purser, Danielle Carter, re-emerged, wheeling a cart laden with fresh headphones, amenity kits, and warm towels. She paused at Nadira's row, her expression sincere and apologetic. "Ms. Lewis," she said quietly, meeting Nadira's gaze, "we want to ensure your final moments on board are comfortable. Please accept these headphones, and do let me know if you need anything else." Nadira lifted the plush headphones, examining the AltaJet logo embroidered on the ear cup. She placed them over her ears, the soft click a satisfying punctuation. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm. "This means a great deal." Danielle Carter offered a genuine smile, then continued down the aisle, making sure each first-class passenger received the same courtesy. The cabin atmosphere shifted subtly, as though a barrier had been lifted. Passengers exchanged relieved glances. A sense of camaraderie, forged in adversity, now enveloped the space. Reese leaned in again. "That felt different," he said, "like we were part of something." Nadira's eyes softened. "We are," she said. "This wasn't just my fight. It became ours." She closed her eyes and traced the outline of her amenity kit, remembering the small indignities that had plagued the flight, the withheld headphones, the spilled water, the curt service. Each slight had felt like a drop of acid eroding her sense of dignity. But each step of resistance, each moment of solidarity from fellow travelers, had built toward tonight's reckoning. The seatbelt sign dinged once more as the plane banked gently over the bay. Nadira opened her eyes and watched the city's grid of lights pass beneath the wing. She thought of the journey that lay ahead, the meeting with Asha Whitmore, the reports to HR, the press conference, the rollout of new training modules. The real work was just beginning. A soft ping indicated that the crew had prepared for landing. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. We will be landing shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft comes to a complete stop." Nadira took a slow breath. She adjusted her scarf, smoothing the fabric across her collar. She reached into her tote for her notebook and flipped to the page where she had listed her post-flight agenda. Debrief with Asha Whitmore. Formalize in-flight training enhancements. Draft public statement on passenger dignity. Establish equity feedback committee. She tapped her fingernail beside the first item. Debrief with Asha. Only one remained unchecked. She closed the notebook and tucked it back into her bag. She looked around the cabin, noting the expressions of her fellow passengers. Some smiled at her silently. Others offered a brief nod. They, too, had become witnesses and participants in a moment of collective justice. It was rare, she thought, for a simple flight to become a crucible for systemic change. Yet here they were. A child's laughter from the row ahead drew Nadira's attention. A young girl, clutching a plush toy, peered around the headrest at the pilots descending the aisle to prepare for deplaning. The girl's eyes were bright with innocent wonder. Nadira remembered her own daughter, whose curiosity and boundless optimism had fueled her pursuit of justice. She smiled, feeling a pang of longing. Reese caught her eye. "Family." Nadira nodded, her voice soft. "Yes, I wish she could be here tonight. But this path I'm forging is for her." Reese placed his hand briefly over Nadira's. "She'll be proud." Nadira returned his gesture with quiet gratitude. The plane's wheels touched ground, and a rhythmic rumble filled the cabin. The collective breathing pattern shifted excitement, relief, anticipation. Luggage overhead rattled slightly as flight attendants moved to open compartments. But instead of the usual bustle of a panicked deboarding rush, the cabin remained composed. Passengers took their time, gathering items and straightening jackets. There was no urgency, just a measured calm, as though they understood the gravity of what had occurred. Danielle Carter returned one final time to Nadira's row with a gentle reminder. "Once the seatbelt sign goes off, please feel free to disembark. Thank you again for your patience." Nadira lifted her gaze to Carter. "Thank you for your support," she said. "Let's ensure the rest of the crew understands the importance of these changes." Carter nodded, her eyes reflecting determination. "They will." The seatbelt sign clicked off. A ripple of movement passed through the cabin. Nadira rose, smoothing her blouse and holding her bag. She gave Reese and Caroline each a grateful nod. As she reached the front of the plane, she saw Asha waiting at the entrance to the jet bridge, flanked by corporate and media staff. Asha's expression was a mixture of relief and readiness. She stepped forward when she saw Nadira. "Dr. Lewis," she said softly, offering her arm. "Thank you for handling this with such integrity." Nadira placed her hand on Asha's arm. "Thank you for listening and for acting." They walked side by side down the jet bridge. Passengers paused to let them pass, some reaching out to offer a brief word of thanks. Cameras flashed as they neared the terminal entrance. Nadira inhaled the cool evening air as they stepped off the bridge. The bustle of the airport terminal washed over them luggage carts, announcements, travelers hurrying to connections, Yet Nadira felt anchored by purpose. Asha led the way to a quiet corner near Gate 22. The corporate communications team assembled tablets and notepads. Legal and HR representatives stood ready. A small crowd of passengers lingered, curious and supportive. Asha turned to Nadira, her voice low but firm. "Let's begin." Nadira nodded and produced her notebook. She opened to the page of bullet points and handed it to Asha. Then she began to speak, her voice steady and clear. "Tonight we witnessed how cumulative microaggressions created a climate of exclusion. We also saw how collective action can restore dignity. Our goal now is to transform these lessons into lasting policy." As Nadira outlined her proposals, mandatory empathy workshops, anonymous passenger feedback loops, performance metrics tied to equitable service, Asha listened intently, occasionally jotting notes. Around them, the hum of airport activity continued, but a circle of attention formed, focused on change. Reese and Caroline watched from the sidelines, their expressions proud. The elderly couple lingered to hear the conversation, embodying the community that had formed on board. Nadira's voice resonated through the terminal. "We will not settle for half measures. We will rebuild trust by embedding respect into every in-flight procedure. We owe that to our passengers, our staff, and our values." Asha looked up and met Nadira's gaze. "Let's make it happen." In that moment, Nadira felt the weight of her experiences transform into momentum. The descent had ended, but the real ascent toward equity, dignity, and systemic reform was only beginning. The roar of the engine softened as Flight 981 approached Gate 22. The cabin lights brightened to their normal level, illuminating the faces of weary travelers ready to disembark. Nadira Lewis sat upright, her carry-on at her feet, reflecting the resolve that had carried her through the flight. Around her, a quiet buzz rippled through the first-class cabin, whispers of anticipation, relief, and curiosity. They had witnessed a transformation in the air, and now they were about to see its culmination. Jessica Monroe's absence was still felt. No trace of the once assertive flight attendant remained in the galley or the aisle. The blank curtain signified her departure, a silent acknowledgement that her behavior had crossed an invisible line. As the seatbelt sign clicked off, Nadira rose, smoothing the lapel of her blazer. Reese Calloway and Caroline Reddick moved alongside her, offering encouraging nods. The elderly couple from row 3 stood as well, their expressions filled with solidarity. Passengers in other rows reached out to Nadira with murmured words of gratitude. A business traveler stopped to say, "Thank you for standing up. It meant more than you know." Nadira offered a gracious nod and a sincere smile. Each interaction reaffirmed that her decision to confront injustice, quietly but firmly, resonated far beyond herself. She took a deep breath and stepped into the jet bridge. The cool San Francisco evening greeted her with a gentle breeze that carried the distant sounds of arriving flights and rolling luggage. A crowd awaited at the end of the bridge security officers, a few media representatives, and AltaJet's leadership team led by Asha Whitmore. Asha stood poised at the front of the group, her arms crossed and a determined expression framed by her tailored suit. When Nadira emerged, Asha stepped forward and clasped her hand warmly. "Welcome to San Francisco," she said, her voice carrying authority and genuine warmth. "Thank you for your patience and courage." Nadira returned the handshake. "Thank you for acting so decisively." Behind the pair, 2 security officers opened a door to a small anteroom. They reappeared with Jessica Monroe, escorted by HR personnel. Jessica's face was pale and her uniform crisp but disheveled. She stared at Nadira with a mixture of shame and anger. The cabin had emptied quickly onto the jet bridge, leaving only a handful of curious onlookers. Asha addressed Jessica in a calm but unambiguous tone. "Jessica Monroe, your conduct on Flight 981 demonstrated a failure to uphold AltaJet's values. Effective immediately. You are relieved of duty and must report to HR for termination proceedings." Jessica opened her mouth, perhaps to defend herself, but no words emerged. She glanced from Asha to Nadira and then back again, her shoulders slumping as the weight of accountability settled in. The HR representatives guided her away, their steps firm but not unkind. As she disappeared through a sidelong corridor door, the echo of her footsteps faded into silence. Nadira felt a wave of emotion, vindication, relief, and a profound sense of justice. The scene unfolded with the quiet dignity she had sought. No public shaming, no spectacle. Instead, firm action by leadership ensured that policy and principle aligned. Asha turned back to Nadira. "I apologize again," she said. "But more importantly, I want you to know we're implementing immediate changes." Nadira's gaze met Asha's. "That's good to hear." Asha gestured toward a small conference area adjacent to the jet bridge entrance. "We've set up a meeting room for a debrief. We'll discuss next steps, training enhancements, accountability protocols, passenger feedback integration." Nadira nodded. Reese and Caroline offered to accompany her, and the trio walked together into the meeting room. Once inside, Asha closed the door and set her tablet on the conference table. The HR and corporate communications team gathered around, ready with notepads and digital recorders. Asha began. "Dr. Lewis, we have your in-flight incident report. Danielle Carter, our purser, has provided her observations as well. Legal and HR have reviewed the situation, and we're prepared to act on every recommendation." Nadira unfolded her own notebook and laid it on the table. The handwritten bullets denied headphones. Water spilled, unequal service. Passenger solidarity each represented a milestone on a path toward accountability. She met Asha's gaze and spoke calmly, but with quiet authority. "Thank you, Asha. Here are my proposals for immediate and long-term reform." She outlined the Equity Feedback Committee, the real-time passenger survey, immersive bias training scenarios, and data-driven performance reviews. As she spoke, the room listened intently, absorbing each detail. Reese and Caroline sat to one side, their presence a reminder that this was not just a corporate matter. They had witnessed the flight's injustices and the solidarity that followed. Their support underscored the human element behind every policy change. One of the legal council members spoke up. "We'll prepare a revised code of conduct reflecting these standards." Another HR representative added, "We'll integrate passenger feedback scores into crew evaluations immediately." Across the table, corporate communications prepared a statement to share with the wider AltaJet community, emphasizing the airline's commitment to dignity and equity. Cameras from the media positioned outside the conference room door would relay the announcement live, ensuring transparency. When the commitments were detailed and timelines established, Nadira closed her notebook. The room exhaled in unison. A sense of purpose had crystallized into action. Asha offered a final nod of gratitude. "Dr. Lewis, your leadership tonight has set a new standard. Thank you for making this possible." Nadira allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you for listening and for responding." They rose from their seats. Reese and Caroline flanked Nadira as they left the meeting room. The terminal lights beckoned them back into the flow of travelers disembarking, reconnecting, moving on. But something fundamental had shifted An airline once complicit in bias had begun charting a course for genuine equity. Outside the terminal doors, the crisp California air carried the promise of fresh beginnings. Nadira breathed it in, feeling the edges of her tension soften into resolve. She thought of her daughter back home, of the countless people who might one day board an AltaJet flight and discover a truly inclusive environment. Asha walked beside her, her voice low as they reached a waiting SUV. "I'll stay in touch. We'll update you on our progress." Nadira nodded. "I look forward to it." As the vehicle pulled away from the terminal, Nadira gazed back at the building, its glass facade reflecting the city lights. Inside, a new chapter had begun, not just for her, but for everyone who valued respect, dignity, and justice at 30,000 feet. Stepping off the SUV, Nadira felt the cool night air of San Francisco brush her face. The airport's glass facade reflected the city lights like a shimmering canvas. Asha Whitmore turned to her, a small smile of exhaustion and pride on her lips. Beside them, Reese Calloway and Caroline Reddick exchanged relieved glances. The events of the flight, from the initial slights to the crew's termination and immediate reforms, had rippled outward, creating momentum none of them had fully anticipated. Inside the terminal, a cluster of media personnel waited, their cameras and microphones poised like curious birds. Asha raised a hand to signal calm before addressing the waiting crowd. "Thank you all for coming. AltaJet Airlines takes passenger dignity and respect very seriously. Effective immediately. We have implemented new equity training, a real-time feedback system, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. This evening's events underscore our commitment to creating a truly inclusive travel experience." Reporters scribbled in notebooks and tapped questions into recorders. One journalist called out, "Ms. Whitmore, will Jessica Monroe face further sanctions? And how quickly will the new training be rolled out?" Asha glanced at Nadira before responding. "We are reviewing all circumstances. Ms. Monroe's termination reflects our immediate response. As for training, we are launching mandatory immersive bias workshops within the next 30 days for all crew and support staff. We will also integrate anonymous passenger feedback into performance evaluations starting next week." Flashing lights from smartphones illuminated the group as reporters tweeted live updates. Nadira felt a surge of satisfaction. This wasn't just a single flight incident. It had become a public statement about accountability and systemic change in an industry that often resisted it. A reporter turned toward Nadira. "Dr. Lewis, as a passenger, what prompted you to insist on immediate action?" Nadira inhaled slowly and met the camera lens. "I believe dignity is a right, not a privilege you earn. When leadership acts swiftly, it sends a message we value every person's humanity. That's why I called Ms. Whitmore to ensure this ends tonight and never happens again." Her words echoed through the microphones. Asha nodded approvingly, then ushered Nadira and their companions toward a waiting conference room for a more private debrief. As they walked, they passed travelers heading to their gates, some pausing to offer thumbs up or quiet congratulations. A lone baggage handler called out, "Good on you," his voice carrying genuine admiration. Inside the conference room, corporate communications specialists and HR executives awaited with dossiers and digital presentations ready. A whiteboard displayed bullet points, incident summary, immediate actions, short-term reforms, long-term strategic plan. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt like an endorsement, bathing the room in optimistic clarity. Asha began with a deep breath. "We have momentum. Public sentiment is with us. We must seize this moment to rebuild trust." She nodded to Nadira. "Dr. Lewis, would you lead us through your recommendations?" Nadira opened her notebook and spoke plainly. First, launch the passenger feedback loop on every flight, accessible via the in-flight entertainment system. It should be brief 2 or 3 questions about fairness and respect. Second, develop immersive training scenarios that put crew members in the shoes of customers experiencing bias. Third, tie equity metrics to performance evaluations, promotion criteria, and annual reviews. She paused, letting each point settle. Finally, establish an independent airport advisory panel composed of frequent flyers, crew representatives, and equity advocates. This panel will review complaints, data trends, and policy proposals quarterly. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. The HR director spoke up. We can have a prototype feedback interface live in 2 weeks. And we already have partners who specialize in immersive bias simulation. Asha keyed notes on her tablet. Excellent. Let's assign a cross-functional team to build the advisory panel charter. We will aim to convene the first meeting within 60 days. Reese and Caroline watched from the corner, proud to see Nadira's ideas taking shape. The elderly couple and a few other passengers who had joined earlier were also present, lending their insights as stakeholder voices. Their perspective grounded the discussion in real human experience. As the meeting closed, Asha stood. Thank you all. Dr. Lewis, your leadership has galvanized us. We will keep you informed every step of the way. Nadira closed her notebook. Thank you for your partnership and for showing that respect cannot wait. They exited the conference room to find Asha's office illuminated with congratulatory emails, messages from advocacy groups, and social media praise. On a screen near the entrance, a live news ticker scrolled headlines. AltaJet terminates crew for discrimination. Passenger leads airline reform. Industry watchers praise swift action. The digital affirmation was gratifying, but Nadira knew impact required sustained follow-through. Later that evening, Nadira sat in a small lounge near the terminal, sipping herbal tea. Reese and Caroline joined her, and the 4 of them reflected on the day's events. Caroline leaned forward. I still can't believe we got to be part of this. Reese nodded. It felt like we were witnessing history. Nadira smiled softly. We were. Change often starts with one person refusing to accept the norm, but real change happens when many choose to stand together. The elderly man from row 3, Mr. Bennett, approached with the woman beside him. Dr. Lewis, he said, clearing his throat. I've flown this route dozens of times. Never felt this sense of community on board. Thank you for leading the way. Nadira reached out and shook his hand. Thank you. Your support made all the difference. As they parted ways, Nadira felt a profound sense of possibility. The flight had been the catalyst. The conversations that followed were the foundation for lasting reform. In her mind, she replayed the quiet gestures at 30,000 feet, the shared towels, the murmured encouragements, the collective demand for fairness. Those moments had coalesced into a force that no policy could ignore. The next morning, Nadira arrived at AltaJet's San Francisco office for a scheduled board meeting. She stepped into a bright conference hall where executives, board members, and union representatives gathered. The air buzzed with anticipatory energy. Asha stood at the head of the table. This morning, we will ratify the new equity and dignity policy. Dr. Lewis has been invited to present the final draft. Nadira stepped forward and laid out the policy document. She walked the board through each section. Definitions of microaggression, reporting mechanisms, feedback metrics, advisory panel charter, and accountability frameworks. She cited data from the flight's events, the number of passengers who supported her, the documented service failures, and the immediate public reaction. Board members nodded, some whispering among themselves. One senior executive spoke up. "This is ambitious, but necessary. Our brand will be stronger for it." Another added, "It's the right thing to do, ethically and commercially." When the vote came, it passed unanimously. Applause filled the room. Nadira stepped back, her chest warmed by the triumph. She glanced at the window, seeing the silhouette of a plane taxiing on the runway below. It would carry the next set of passengers, who would experience a different culture, one informed by tonight's lessons. Later, back in her hotel room, Nadira sat at the desk and typed a brief public statement for her nonprofit's blog. She wrote about dignity as a universal right, shared insights from the flight, and encouraged other industries to follow suit. She scheduled the post to go live at dawn. As she prepared for sleep, she paused by the window, watching the city's lights weave patterns across the bay. In that moment, she reflected on how a single flight and ordinary journey had become extraordinary. It had been a microcosm of society's deep-seated biases and the power of collective action to dismantle them. She whispered a silent vow. This was just the beginning. With that resolve settling in her heart, she lay down, allowing the quiet promise of change to carry her toward restful sleep. The next day would bring new challenges, but she was ready for her daughter, for her community, and for every passenger who might one day board a flight and find respect waiting in the seat beside them. The next morning, San Francisco's clear dawn light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the AltaJet headquarters. Dr. Nadira Lewis stood at the entrance to a large conference hall, watching as attendees arrived for the inaugural meeting of the Elevate Initiative, AltaJet's global program for inclusion and respect. The name was chosen to symbolize uplift, both literally in the skies and figuratively in the hearts of everyone who flew with the airline. Board members, senior executives, flight attendants, ground crew representatives, passenger advocates, and a handful of media outlets assembled in clusters. Each person carried the morning's energy-renewed purpose, cautious optimism, and the memory of last night's decisive actions. Asha Whitmore, radiant in a navy suit, approached Nadira and offered a firm handshake. "Welcome to Elevate's launch," she said, her eyes shining with anticipation. "Thank you," Nadira replied, returning the handshake. "I'm honored to see how far this has come in such a short time." Asha smiled. "All thanks to your leadership." Nadira shook her head. "It was never just me." At exactly 9:30, Asha took the stage. She began by recounting the events of Flight 981 the headphones denied, the spilled water, the passenger solidarity, the crew's removal, and the swift reforms. Her voice was steady, clear, and unapologetic. The audience listened intently. The weight of her words settled over the room like a gentle fog, prompting nods of agreement and occasional expressions of reflection. When Asha finished, she gestured toward Nadira. "And now, I invite Dr. Nadira Lewis to outline our path forward." Nadira stepped up, her presence calm yet commanding. She cleared her throat softly, then began. "Good morning. Last night, we witnessed a microcosm of bias aboard Flight 981. We also witnessed accountability in action and the power of solidarity. Today, we build on that moment. We launch Elevate an initiative rooted in empathy, data, and action." She paused to let the concept resonate. "We will focus on 4 areas. First, continuous equity training. Every flight attendant, pilot, and ground staff member will undergo immersive scenarios that foster understanding of microaggressions and their impact. Second, real-time passenger feedback. Every first-class and economy passenger will have the option to provide brief, anonymous feedback on their service experience. This data will feed our equity dashboard, accessible to management in real time. Hands rose across the room as participants took notes fervently. Nadira continued, "Third, the Airport Advisory Panel. This group will convene quarterly and include passenger and employee representatives. Their role is to review data trends and advise leadership on policies. Fourth, public transparency. We will publish annual reports on our progress, successes, and areas for improvement. We will hold ourselves accountable not just internally, but publicly." She closed her notebook and looked across the audience. This is not a one-time fix. It is an ongoing journey. I invite each of you to join me in lifting our standards, our awareness, and our commitment to dignity. Applause filled the hall. Asha returned to the stage and joined Nadira, offering a shared bow. The open acknowledgement of ownership and promise of continuous improvement solidified the initiative's credibility. After the formal presentation, attendees broke into workshops. Nadira floated between groups, sharing insights and listening to feedback. Flight attendants spoke of their eagerness to learn new skills. Pilots discussed how respecting passengers fit into broader safety culture. Ground staff expressed relief at having a clear channel for reporting observed bias. Passenger advocates offered suggestions for improving survey design. Reese and Caroline, invited as charter members of the advisory panel, conferred with UX designers about making feedback more inclusive. Their experience as flight allies provided invaluable perspective. Lunch passed in a flurry of conversation. Nadira noticed staff members wearing Elevate pins on their lapels, a small but powerful sign of unity. She paused by the coffee station to chat with Danielle Carter, the purser who had first taken her complaint. "Danielle," Nadira said warmly, "your support was pivotal." Danielle smiled. "Thank you for trusting me to address it. I've already begun training modules for my team." Nadira nodded appreciatively. "Together, we're making sure bias has no home on AltaJet flights." Later in the afternoon, Nadira and Asha sat down for a one-on-one interview with a travel magazine. The journalist asked how Nadira's personal experience translated into an industry-wide movement. Nadira replied, "Systems change when people recognize that policies must align with practice. My flight was an example of why we need constant vigilance. Elevate ensures we remain vigilant, creative, and accountable in real time." The interviewer smiled. It's a powerful story of how one flight can transform an entire airline. Nadira agreed. She felt the weight of that transformation settling in her mind. It was a reminder that individual actions could foster systemic change. As the day wound down, Nadira returned to her hotel room overlooking the bay. She placed a call to her daughter's phone. "Hey, sweetheart," she said when the voicemail picked up. "I wanted you to hear my voice. I'm working on something important that will make travel safer and more respectful for everyone, including you, when you grow up." She paused, her voice softening. "I love you. I miss you. And I want you to know that no matter what, you deserve dignity and respect." She ended the call and gazed out at the city skyline. The lights mirrored the stars she had admired mid-flight. Those pinpoints of light seemed to nod back at her, as if reminding her that ripples began with small acts. Yesterday's flight had been one such act. Today's Elevate launch was the next. She slid into bed exhausted but content. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from colleagues around the globe. She typed quick replies, offering gratitude and encouragement. Soon she set the phone aside and closed her eyes. As sleep claimed her, she dreamed of future flights where crew and passenger united in mutual respect, where bias was flagged and corrected instantly, where every journey began and ended with dignity intact. above her, unseen yet guiding. The Elevate initiative took flight. Its ripples would expand across the skies. One cabin, one story, one stand for justice at a time. As the cabin empties and dawn breaks, Dr. Nadira Lewis's fight becomes our call to action. Dignity is not a privilege, but a right. We've seen how small acts of bias can erode respect, and how collective courage can rebuild it stronger than ever. Let's carry that lesson beyond this flight and into every corner of our lives. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more tales that challenge injustice and inspire change. Your next journey starts here. See you on the next flight.